Hi, my name is Dan, and in this video I'm going to show you some stuff about variables in blueprint scripts in Unreal. So this is part of a series of videos that I've done on using blueprint scripts in Unreal. I've got a standard third-person template set up, and I've got a little blueprint that I've created, and I'll just open that up and show you what's in here. There's just a pad to stand on, and a collision box which will register when the player character stands on that or moves off. Okay, so and I've got an instance of it in the world here. So I'll go back into that script because what we need to do is to start talking about and using variables. Now, you've probably done some programming in the past, but if you haven't, I'm going to try and give you some of the basic understanding here. To be honest, if you haven't done any programming at all, you're going to struggle to get to grips with blueprint scripting through my tutorials, because I generally assume that you've done something. So I hope you know that the idea of a variable is that it's something that can store a value. And variables, in this particular instance, are contained within the blueprint class. So we're going to add a new variable to this class. Excuse me, and I'm going to call it isOn. Now, Unreal is what's called a typed environment, which means that the variables have associated with them a type, or which describes the kind of number or the kind of information that it's holding. And there are several basic types. And if you go up here on the right hand side, there's a drop down box. I can highlight. There's boolean, which is bytes, which is an integer number stored in a very small bit of memory. It's an 8-bit number. Tend not to use those. There's integer, which stores, I believe, in a 32-bit integer, which gives you quite a lot of range. There's an integer 64 in case you really want high integers. There's floating point numbers. So again, if you've done any typed programming before, you'll know that this means numbers that can have decimal points and fractional bits. And then there's a few others here. There's a string, and these are more complex data types as we go further down here. And there's a whole load of others that are available. I'm really not going to deal with those in any great depth. So in this video, we're going to focus on the Boolean type, and the integer and the floating point, which are the three most common, if you like, basic types or primitive types. So a Boolean, again, hopefully you know, but if you don't, it's just basically it allows you to store either a value true or a value false, and it actually literally stores that effectively as a number 0 or a number 1. And these are quite useful for doing if statements and while loops and things like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce this variable isOn, and we're going to switch it on or turn it to true when the actor steps on the plate, and turn it to false when the actor steps off the plate. I've happened to have also got up the actor end overlap node up here, as well as the actor begin overlap node. I'm not going to deal with testing whether the actor that's overlapping is the player, because there's only one moving thing in our little game scene, which is the player. Now I've dragged that in. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of ways of setting a variable. So the first one is if you drag in and just let go of that, it then gives you a choice of get or set. And there are two things you might want to do with the variable. One is to change the value, and the other one is to see the value and to do something depending on that value. So at this point in time, we're setting isOn. The other way to do that is to drag and then hold the left Alt key and drop, and that'll give you set. Now, if you drag and you hold the left Control key, that gives you a get. And they look different. And a get doesn't need a control flow pin going into it. So just going to drag that control flow to there, and we're going to set it to true when the player overlaps and false when the player leaves. So there we go. And this is it in action. Yes, you could. Oh, there's nothing to see. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to make that say something. As the settings on, we're going to do print string. And we're going to take that boolean and plug it in here. Now, I've been talking about types. And a string is another primitive type, or sort of. But it doesn't hold a number, it holds some text. And what's happened when I've dragged from a boolean type? Yes, you'll notice that different types are different colours, which they are in this drop-down box, but also the wires that transmit that information are the colour of the variable colour as well. So red for boolean, pink for string. And this is an automatic converter. So if I pull a boolean to where it's expecting a string, it automatically plugs in this conversion for me. So it's doing that for both of those. So that'll convert it into something that will be printable on the screen. Let's see that in action. So play, and as we go on, it says true. As we come off, it says false. And so whatever that value is that's actually held inside the boolean is being converted to true and false, the text. Okay. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use a second boolean variable, and I'm going to do what's called exposing a variable, which means you can actually change the value of the variable through the world outliner or through the details pane in the level editor for a particular instance of a class. So I'm going to create this one, again, another boolean. I'm going to call it is talkative. So this is going to switch whether the scripts actually send out print strings or not, and tell you what's going on. So this is going to have I'm going to change this to a branch. I can't spell branch. There we go. And I'm going to do another branch down here. So this one will depend on that too. Branch. Something quite cute happened there. If I dragged out and then typed in branch, is it automatically wired it up from the old wires for me? Unreal can sometimes do that for you, which is quite helpful. And we're going to make that dependent on is talkative. So I'm going to do a getter for is talkative for both of these. What's going on? Right. Now, if we want to be able to alter this for the different instances of the class, what we need to do is to do this thing that I mentioned called exposing a variable. And that's what this little icon here is at the right-hand side next to it, is that this looks like a closed eye. And if I click it, it becomes an open eye. And that means that it's visible outside the class and other things can have access to it. It's saying over here, if you want a default value, it says, please compile the blueprint. So if I compile the blueprint, then it says is talkative, and I can set it to be either true or false as default. I'm going to leave it as false. Okay, and compile. And then I'm going to create a second instance of this blueprint in the world. And as you see, that's now been selected as I've dropped it in. And it's got down here in the details, it's got that variable exposed. And it's talkative, it's got a checkbox, and currently it's false, and I can make it true. I'm going to leave that one false, but I'm going to get the other one and tick true on that. So what should happen is this one here, as I go on and off, gives you the true false. This one over here doesn't, because that's dependent on that Boolean variable, the is talkative variable, as to whether it's going to be talkative and tell us what's going on or not. Okay, so let's next look at an integer variable. So integer variables are ones that can hold whole numbers, anything from 0 up to a certain limit, and then to minus a certain limit, whatever that is. It's I believe a couple of million. So I'm going to create a thing called, and I'm going to call it a variable. I'm going to call it counter, and this is going to count how many times we step onto that plate. Now, by default, it's given us a variable of the type that's the last type that I made, and if I haven't changed the type of any variables that I made, it gives you a boolean. And there are two ways of changing this. So one of which is the drop-down box on the right-hand side. The other is to just click on the little red indicator there. And we're going to change that to integer. So what we're going to do with this counter is every time the player steps on that plate, we're going to increment that counter and make it add up the times that the player steps onto the plate. So I've just moved things across because I'm going to do a little bit of processing here, and I want to do it before the branch because I don't want it to depend on whether the plate has got this is talkative variable set or not. So I'm just going to do it before the branch to make that easier. And I'm going to use the counter there, and I'm typing in plus, which is used in quite a lot of textual programming languages for increment. And there's a node here, increment int, and what that's going to do is it's going to add 1 every time it goes through that node to that variable. Okay, and then instead of printing out the is on, we're going to actually plug that in instead, and we're going to print out that count. Go on. So hopefully that will now count every time we step onto the plate. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, and the other one will be counting, but it's not telling us anything because it's not set to be talkative. Okay. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to, let's go back out there, is I'm going to set that second one to be talkative because I'm going to show you something. So both of those are now talkative. This one's counting 1, 2, 3. What's going to happen when I walk on this one? It starts from 1, 2, and they're counting independently of each other. And the point of doing that is to show you that the numbers that are stored are in those variables are specific to the instance of the class, and that it stores those values differently for different instances depending on the processing and the scripts, what's going on. Okay, so I'm going to move on, and we're going to do a floating point variable. And actually what we're going to do is we're going to count, use that to count the time, or to see how long it is since we've started playing. And we seem to have lost in this script the tick, so I'm just going to bring back the event tick. So in a different video, I've talked about the events nodes and what happens here. This delta seconds gives us a fraction of a second from the previous time that it's been gone through, and it goes through every time a frame is rendered for the game. So that's what this tick is. And what we're going to do is we're going to keep a count of how many seconds the time as time goes along. And the way to do this is to get that. Sorry, I don't want the counter. I need a floating point variable. Let's call it timer. I'm going to change that to a floating point number. And we're going to do a getter on that, and we're going to add to that this fraction of a second every time we go through. So it's going to keep constant track of how long it is since we started playing. And this structure of a getter adding something and then a setter is really common in lots of situations in programming, but certainly in blueprint scripts. You'll see this quite often. So that will be happening every time a tick happens, and that will keep that variable up to date. And then we can use that variable in other bits of script inside the class. And we're going to use this for it's going to be printed when the player steps off the plate. So the counter is working when you step on the plate, or displayed when you step on the plate, and the timer is displayed when you step off. Right, let's go and have a look at that. So here we go. Counting 1, off 2.93. So that's the number of seconds. Okay. So an interesting thing to notice here, you remember with the integer that is counting these independently. With the timer, it looks as if it's doing them the same, and if it's using the same variable, but it's not. What's actually happening is that each of these plates has a timer that's counting the time, and they're both going, constantly running, so they will give the same accurate time number there up on the screen. So we've quickly done stuff about variables. We've had created some variables down here. We've looked at booleans. We've got integers. We've got a floating point number. We've seen strings because they're the ones that come out in print string, which are pink. We've used getters and we've used setters and done a little bit of manipulation of those numbers. And that's it from me for now.